good morning. Welcome to episode 90 of Duval Rundown. My name is Gus Logue. Today I'm joined, as I am each and every Thursday, by Mia O'Brien. You can catch on Helmets and Heels each weekday on 1010XL 92.5 on her show, Helmets and Heels, noon to 2 p.m. Today, also at noon, is the tip-off of March Madness. The NCAA Tournament begins today. Our Florida Gators are a number one seed, so definitely we'll be taking them to win the championship. But today, me and I would be filling out a bracket, NFL style, Jaguars themed. So before we get into all of that, Mia, welcome back. How you doing?
I'm ready to rumble, Gus. You sent me our NFL style bracket. Yes, folks, wait till you see exactly what we're gonna roll out here today. And I couldn't help but feel like it was Christmas morning, just seeing a bracket, knowing that there will be action on said bracket today, both here on Duval Rundown, but also the real bracket when it comes to the men's basketball tournament and the women's basketball tournament, by the way, which officially round of 64 kicks off tomorrow. But that's a story for another time. We're ready to dive into this very specific NFL style bracket.
Right. Yeah. I figured maybe if we have time at the end, we'll give a little bit of just tips and advice for the real bracket challenge. But this is our bracket challenge. This is what we came up with. All the third place teams from the 2024 NFL season. So third place is, and they finished third in their respective divisions. We've got an 8-team bracket. Surprisingly, I didn't realize this until I made the bracket. The Jaguars are the lowest seed. They were 4-13 last year. That's the worst record among all third place teams. And they have the 8 seed, and they will be playing the Green Bay Packers, who were in third place last year, despite finishing with an 11-6 record. So could be a quick out for the Jaguars, honestly. But I was thinking maybe we'll talk through each matchup, and if we disagree, then we'll do a poll and let the people do the tiebreaker.
Like
Should we do that, Mia?
I like that. Let's do it, Gus.
All right. Well, let's start off talking about this first matchup that we have. Again, the Packers versus the Jaguars, two third-place teams. And I guess the question is, or we're filling out the bracket in terms of who will do better, who will have a better, at least regular season record in 2025. So, Mia, a little bit of a tough draw again for the Jaguars being the 8 seed. But what do you think about this first round matchup?
It is indeed, Gus, but here's my thing. What's your level of belief in Jordan Love? Because I would put it, for those who doubt Trevor Lawrence, for those who say that Trevor has not lived up to expectations, for those who say that Trevor's biggest success was in an 8-game spurt at the end of his second season, is that not what we've seen from Jordan Love? Yes, he led the Packers back to the playoffs last year. Yes, he suffered an injury in week 1 in Brazil. But ultimately, I don't feel like he moved the needle all that much in year 3, much like Trevor Lawrence. The argument can be made for his third year in the league. And then, of course, his injury marred fourth year in the NFL. And so I think a lot of this conversation has to begin with, what is your level of belief in Jordan Love? The difference, of course, between the Green Bay Packers ecosystem and the Jacksonville Jaguars ecosystem last year, and even heading into this year, I guess you could make the argument, is that they have an entrenched coach and an offensive genius in Matt LaFleur calling plays and leading the ship.
Yeah, that's really what it came down to for me, because I do think it should start with Jordan Love. I think that he definitely has shown flashes of being a great quarterback, like a borderline top 5, top 6 kind of guy. But those flashes, I feel like, are more of trick shot throws that are certainly amazing plays. But I think that he can still grow a little bit in terms of processing and doing true drop back stuff. I think that obviously Matt LaFleur does a lot of heavy lifting with his scheme up there in Green Bay. And even if they're missing a true number 1 wide receiver and kind of need that desperately in order to take the next leap as an offense, they do have a lot of great surrounding pieces. They made, I think, kind of an objective overpay in free agency by adding Aaron Banks. But at the same time, he is a really good scheme fit for them, especially with what they want to do with Josh Jacobs, their free agent addition at running back last year. So just the ecosystem as a whole, I have more faith in. I think that I personally think that Trevor's a better quarterback than Jordan, but obviously they both have to work on consistency. And so to me, it kind of came down with the ecosystem around them and more so the head coach, because maybe hopefully Liam Cohen will end up great, but right now Matt LaFleur has the 3rd highest winning percentage among all active NFL head coaches, behind only Nick Sirianni and John Harbaugh. but he's ahead of Kevin O'Connell, Sean McDermott, Andy Reid, Mike Tomlin, John Harbaugh, Sean Payton, even above Bill Belichick for all-time winning percentage. And so Matt LaFleur, objectively a great head coach, especially in the regular season since Packers haven't gotten too far. And so I trust the Packers to certainly have another double-digit win season. And to me, like, this came down to not just like the coaching difference of like a sure thing in my eyes and Matt LaFleur, again, at least in the regular season, versus a relative unknown in Liam Cohen, but also like I wonder if the Jaguars are going to be a little bit less competitive than people might expect or hope, just because of the way they've operated this offseason. I mean, obviously, if Trevor Lawrence is the type of quarterback a lot of us think that he is, then that like timeline can be accelerated and the Jaguars might be very competitive very quickly. But I mean, they were one of two teams to not re-sign any of their players from last season. And they also cut Evan Engram and Christian Kirk, which I think a lot of us were expecting maybe one of them would be gone. But I think that the reason it was such a big surprise to a lot of us is that like we all thought that the Jaguars were going to try to turn around the ship and win games immediately. And obviously they are going to be trying to win games, but I think that they're understandably and correct for doing, taking kind of like the longer approach, trying to build up draft capital rather than like taking swings and overbidding for a Chris Godwin or a Cooper Kupp, something like that. And so I think that they're kind of have a longer viewpoint in mind, which I think is good for the long-term sustainability of the team's success. But at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if the Jaguars are just not quite as good as people expect, like right away. And again, on the other hand, they're facing the number one seed in our bracket here, the Packers. And so I do have more confidence in the Packers doing better than the Jaguars next season.
Cedric in the comments on YouTube, I tried. I was going to try to make an argument for an 8 seed over a 1 seed in this NFL style March Madness bracket. But unfortunately, Gus has certainly proven, yes, the Packers over the Jaguars in this bracket of third place teams from 1 year ago. I also want to note, though, the division, the NFC North at large.
Sure.
The fact that 3 teams made the postseason a year ago, J.J. McCarthy becoming the starter in Minnesota, much of the same belief that we just alluded to when it comes to Matt LaFleur, I think can also be said league-wide for Kevin O'Connell. But ultimately, I think one of those 2 teams has to take a step back, especially if the Chicago Bears are to become more competitive under Ben Johnson. And so that is also where I look at this and I say, could the Jaguars finish with a better record? But for the sake of time, we will keep it moving and we will have the Green Bay Packers advance to the semifinals, the final 4, if you may, of this 8-team bracket. Who do we have next, Gus?
Yeah, so the Packers will be facing, let me pull it up here. They'll be facing the winner of this next matchup, the 4-seeded Arizona Cardinals, who finished 8-9 last season, against the 5-seeded Dallas Cowboys, who finished 7-10 last season. Mia, what are your thoughts on this matchup between the Cardinals and the Cowboys?
I mean, here's the thing. Like, if you want to talk about the Jaguars perhaps not being as competitive, so to speak, as many hope and pray that they will be, that this will be a double-digit win season in year 1 under Liam Cohen, look no further than the Arizona Cardinals. I don't think the Jaguars are going to tear it down quite to that extent, but that is the most recent example of a team that literally went down to ground zero in a very competitive division. And at the very least, I think they were frisky throughout the course of the 2024 season. And certainly the fact that they have a higher seed in this bracket than the Dallas Cowboys, America's team, says something. I think for me, though, I will go with the Cowboys, even with a first-time head coach in Brian Schottenheimer. Something tells me that you may be going Cardinals, Gus. So folks in the comments, we may have a poll coming up here soon, because I just come back to the sheer talent on the roster. And while the Cardinals have a decent amount of draft capital here in this April's NFL draft, the Cowboys still have Micah Parsons. They still have CeeDee Lamb, and they still have an offensive line that I think is kind of underrated. Yes, there's some older pieces that probably need to be regenerated, but as we saw with the selection of Cooper Beebe last year, who had never played center before, and he was a more than capable center in his rookie season, and I expect him to take the next step. Yes, there will be questions about a first-time head coach. There are always questions about Dak Prescott, but for me, I think the sheer talent of the Cowboys roster wins out.
Yeah, go ahead and get that poll ready,
Yeah.
I totally hear you. I completely agree.
Am I putting the poll in the chat, Gus, or do you want me to put it up?
Yeah. Can you like do a poll like in
Yes.
the like?
Yep,
You know what I'm
I
saying?
got you. I got you.
Try
Don't
to do
you
that.
worry.
But yeah, so like the Cowboys, objectively a more talented team, and I think that does go a long way and probably could and should be the deciding factor. But I'm going with the Cardinals just because to me, the Cowboys do not pass the vibe check, and the Cardinals do. I think that Jonathan Gannon there in Arizona is going to be recognized as one of the better coaches in the league after not too long. I've always been a Kyler believer. I don't think he's necessarily like going to be a true MVP like finalist candidate a lot of years in his career, but I certainly think he's an above average starter. I think that they have some things to work out with Marvin Harrison in terms of how they're deploying him. It was a bit static last year. They almost used him as a decoy, but it's freaking Marvin Harrison Jr. You got to be able to like scheme him open a little bit, or not even necessarily scheme him open, but just like diversify his route tree a little bit so that defenses don't know what to expect. And so they certainly have some things to work on. They certainly have some talent they need to add, but I'm just a fan of the culture that Gannon is setting there. And I don't know what the culture in Dallas is right now. I mean, there was the Twitter feud online between DeMarcus Lawrence, who signed with Seattle and said he knew that he was never going to win a Super Bowl in Dallas. And he got into it on Twitter with Micah Parsons, who, by the way, is the only star from his draft class, only first-round star from his draft class who hasn't been signed to an extension, which, like, why?
Jerry. That's why. Jerry.
Yeah.
The same guy who hired Brian Schottenheimer to be the head coach. That's why.
Right. And, like, I think Brian Schottenheimer, like, could be okay. And, like, I actually do like the moves that they made at coordinators on both sides of the ball. But, like, I feel like it's just, like a solid, steady hire without much of a ceiling. I feel like that's basically Mike McCarthy all over again. And so, again, like, the Cowboys, certainly a talented roster, but just don't pass the vibe check for me. I think the Cardinals will be really scrappy and like maybe eke out one more win than Dallas next year.
Well, for the sake of time, Gus, I think you're in luck. We only have a handful of votes in so far, but hey, let's keep it moving. Maybe this will change, but the Arizona Cardinals right now have the vote to advance to the next round, where they will face the Green Bay Packers in this bracket of teams that finished in third place in their respective divisions from a year ago.
All right, to keep it moving, we got two more first-round matchups. This next one is between the 2-seeded Denver Broncos, who finished 10-7 last year, against the 7-seeded New York Jets, who finished 5-12. Mia, thoughts on Broncos versus Jets?
Okay, so here's the thing. You could pull up Brandon's comment in the YouTube chat. He brings up a really good point. That was with regards to the NFC North, but I think that this could also be said about the AFC West. All those teams in the NFC North got to play the lowly AFC South. And so I'm pulling up right now because I am curious who the Broncos will play. Here are their opponents: the Chiefs, the Chargers, the Raiders, of course, a home and home. The Jaguars, the Titans, the Cowboys, the Giants, the Bengals, the Packers, the Texans, the Colts, the Eagles, the Commanders, the Jets. That is why I am picking the Broncos in this situation. Yes, I certainly think that they exceeded all expectations in year one of Bo Nix, year two of Sean Payton and Mile High. But I also think that this is a team that could, I don't want to say flirt with disaster, but it feels like, and you tell me your thoughts, Gus, this feels like a team that is pushing all its chips to the middle of the table. And I'm a little worried that maybe that's too early in the maturation process, both for the quarterback and the entire ecosystem, for them to be doing such a thing.
Yeah, I think that they probably outperformed expectations a little bit. Even outperformed their record a little bit. The Broncos did last year. At the same time,
they were playing a last place schedule last year.
Yeah, they were playing a last place schedule. I think even like within the schedule, they got a little bit lucky in terms of like rest advantages or like playing backup quarterbacks, certain things like that. I think they were also like a relatively healthy team. They did lose like Riley Moss during the season, their cornerback, which was kind of a big deal because they're so man heavy and aggressive as a defense. But I also liked the pieces they added to that defense, especially Talise Hufanga from the Niners. Thought he was a little bit overrated in general, honestly, and I was hoping the Jaguars wouldn't be interested in his services just because he's like kind of like a specific like role player, and I know that his niche role would specifically fit in what Jacksonville's defense wants to do. But he's just such a downfield like flying playmaker, like almost like I feel like he's been getting this comp for a while, but like Troy Polamalu light, and that's like the perfect fit in Vance Joseph's defense in Denver. And then I think Evan Engram, certainly don't expect him to be as productive as Jimmy Graham was in his heydays with Sean Payton in New Orleans, but I think he could certainly have some flashes and be productive in the quote-unquote joker role in Sean Payton's offense. And so, yeah, I do like the moves that they've made, but like I'm not necessarily thinking that like, oh, this pushes them to like true playoff, not just playoff contention, since I think they did make the playoffs last year, but like AFC title type contention. I'm still not quite there as much as I do like Sean Payton and Vance Joseph. Like, I don't know. Bo Nix certainly, I think, outplayed everyone's expectations last year, but
I think
it
this
was
might.
1 year.
I think
Small
my
sample
feelings,
size.
my feelings, Gus, may be because recency bias of Kevin and I were doing a mock draft together last night just for fun as we're sitting on the couch in between the first 4 games. Yes, because that's the weird things that I do in my household on a Wednesday night. And as we were doing it, PFF, and again, look, these mock draft simulators, they are robots, they are AI. But there was a trade proposal for the Jaguars at 5 from the Broncos at 20 to
Mm.
essentially move up to draft Ashton Genty, which, like, I don't think that that is a reality, but I do think that there is a world in which Sean Payton becomes aggressive in the NFL draft and
Mm.
tries to identify some marquee player that he believes is going to move the needle because his quarterback, for lack of a better term, is in that category of elite game manager potential, but perhaps not a game changer. And so you need to fill out that roster around him. And so maybe it's just me after coming off of that exercise last night that I'm like, oh, they're going to get weird and they're going to say, this is our window. This is now. And I think they may still be a year away from truly competing, especially as we saw with the Jaguars here locally and the Texans last year. For what it's worth, if they didn't play in the worst division in football, the argument could be made when you go from playing a last place schedule to a first place or second, or in this case, third, which really helps the Broncos, that really affects that next year as you're trying to ascend in the league.
Totally. So we agree that the Broncos might be a little bit overhyped in general. But at the same time, we still are picking them
Yes.
to do better than.
Yes, we spent the
New
last
York
4 minutes bashing the Broncos, but I would never take the Jets over the Broncos.
Yeah.
With all due respect to our friend Taylor Dahl's beloved Justin Fields,
Hmm.
with all due respect to a Jets defense that still I think has pieces and certainly will have another electric play caller in Aaron Glenn. Yeah, too much new in New York for me, so I am taking the Broncos.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what that Sauce Gardner contract looks like, but definitely interested to see what the Aaron Glenn era ends up looking like, but also definitely not expecting a very hot start. So the Broncos will advance in this round. Our last first round matchup is between the 3-seeded Cincinnati Bengals, who finished 9-8 last year, against the 6-seeded Carolina Panthers, who finished 5-12 last year. What do you think, Mia? Are you more of a believer in the Bryce Young assance or in the Bengals' like monster grouping on offense of the 3-headed monster: T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, Joe Burrow?
Two basketball analogies here, Gus. Yes, the Bengals truly believe they're just going to win every game 101-94, and it doesn't matter because they're just going to outscore you and they will sustain longer than you, which,
Yeah.
hey, listen, offense sells tickets, defense wins championships. I'm curious how it pays off for them in terms of being in that upper echelon. I'm going to give it to the Bengals here. I do think Dave Canales is an underrated play caller still in the National Football League. I think he did yeoman's work last year with Bryce Young and with the Carolina Panthers. Ultimately, this is a Panthers team that I believe is still a year away, but it's largely because of the defensive side of the ball. Derek Brown missing so much time with injury. Certainly, hey, they roll out the red carpet for J.C. Horn, but he's had an injury-plagued career as well. I think there's still 1 or 2 pass rushers away. Meanwhile, yes, the Cincinnati Bengals are deficient on the defensive side of the ball. They will have a new defensive coordinator, but ultimately, I have to go with Joe Burrow because he's a winner. He's going to find a way. But don't count out the Panthers, especially in a division that much like the AFC South, the NFC South, things could get a little wacky. And that is as someone who, independent of the Liam Cohen hostage situation, has a lot of respect for Jason Licht, has a lot of respect for Todd Bowles and what they've been able to build in Tampa Town.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think that the Panthers are like the perfect team of like they're a year away. Like that's just the best description for them. Well, it's insane. Like I still can't wrap my head around the fact that Bryce Young outplayed C.J. Stroud in the second half of last season, which I'm certainly still a believer in C.J. Stroud.
I think it's Dave.
Would rather have him, but
Dave doesn't get enough credit. I think
yeah.
Dave Canales deserves a lot more credit for what he did last year.
Including with the offensive line too. Like that was the big piece of it. They certainly added a lot of expensive free agents, especially on the interior last offseason. But it's one thing to get guys in the building. That's another thing to make it a cohesive unit, especially on the offensive line, which we know that like the cohesiveness and people playing together matters more for that unit perhaps than any other.
One thing that I heard from somebody at the Combine who works in the Panthers organization, and I was asking about Liam Cohen, of course, both he and Dave coming from Tampa Bay, more of a coincidence than anything. But how this person described it to me was when it comes to play calling, and I feel like we've experienced this, Gus, firsthand, having watched Press Taylor attempt to call plays for the last 2+ years. When it comes to play calling, it's one of those things where you either have it or you don't. And as a fan or a media member or just outside watcher of football, when you see it, when you see the rhythm and the fluidity of someone who can call plays, you feel it. And Dave Canales is one of those people, and that's what this person was saying, independent of working for the Panthers. This idea of when you're watching, you're saying, oh, okay, I see why he's running the ball because he's trying to set this play up. Okay, he's taking a deep shot there because he's trying to set this up. And I think that that is such an underrated quality that, like, when we talk about, when everyone laments about Press Taylor, or when you lament about why Trevor Lawrence's career has been, the career trajectory has been stunted, like, that is something that I just think as a collective football community, I think we take for granted those few people on the face of the earth who have this God-given ability, whether it's Liam Cohen, Dave Canales, Andy Reid, go on down the line, who just can sense and have that sixth sense of, ooh, let me create this play to set up this play. And I think that's a huge reason why Bryce Young did take the next step.
Absolutely. And that's kind of taken for granted for a lot of coaches, even like Kyle Shanahan and Sean McVay.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's what makes them Kyle Shanahan and Sean McVay. We see so many of their assistants go out to different places. Obviously, a decent amount have had success, but there's way more that have not had success because, they're not able to teach the concepts and the whole playbook as well as those two. But even more so, it's just they're not great at what you're saying, just calling the plays and having a flow and having one thing set up another. The sequencing of plays is what makes or breaks a play caller, and Dave Canales certainly has that. And so I think we agree that we like where the Panthers are going under Dave. Bryce Young's renaissance last year was impressive, but for 2025, we do expect the Cincinnati Bengals to do better.
We're going with the Bengals, and we're going chalk pretty much across the board,
We
Gus.
We are.
Which, as I was prepping for this podcast, I was listening to a basketball podcast. Look at this. Chalk, literally chalked into the bracket, folks.
Uh-huh.
Never say Gus Logue isn't working hard at work, folks. But no, I think that, I was just listening to one of my, One Shining podcasts, and they said the expectation from the gambling folks at the Ringer is that this year's NCAA men's basketball tournament will go pretty chalk. We're going pretty chalk. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I want upsets. Are we going to get an upset between the Packers and the Cardinals in round 2?
Yeah, let's talk about it. We did all 4 of the top seeds advance. So in the semifinals, we've got the Packers versus the Cardinals, 1 seed versus 4 seed, and then the 2-seeded Broncos against the 3-seeded Bengals. So yeah, let's talk about the Packers versus the Cardinals first. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but who do you think will do better in 2025, Mia?
I'm just going to have to go with the Packers for the same reason we went with the Bengals over the Panthers in the previous matchup we discussed, solely because I believe in the head coach. I believe that even if pieces don't perform up to expectation, I trust Matt LaFleur to push the right buttons to get the most out of that team, even if they don't have a number 1 wide receiver, which, speaking of the exercise that I was going through last night, I am very interested if the Green Bay Packers listen to Josh Jacobs and do they draft a wide receiver high, especially because when you look at their defensive side of the ball, I mean, the depth chart is absolutely loaded, Gus. And in addition to trusting Matt LaFleur, I also have earned a lot of respect for Jeff Hafley over the last year and his time with the Green Bay Packers, and talking to people around that organization, and just the rebirth and the juice that he really brought for that side of the ball. Hopefully Anthony Campanelli can bring that same juice here to Jacksonville.
Fingers crossed, indeed. Yeah, I'm going to go with Green Bay here. They are the 1 seed, finished 11-6 last year. I think to reiterate an earlier point, I think the main reason that the Packers wouldn't advance to this hypothetical championship in this bracket that we set up is because their division, because they were so good last year, the NFC North, even if they do take a step back, there's undoubtedly a lot of talent, a lot of great coaches, a lot of just competition in that division. But Green Bay will be advancing to the championship round, and they will be taking on one of the Broncos or the Bengals. This one's pretty juicy. I think this will be the closest kind of debate that we've had since Cowboys versus Cardinals. So what do you think? Who's going to do better between the Broncos and the Bengals, 2 AFC South teams next season?
if you join the show late, we may need a poll for this one. I'm going to go with a pseudo upset here with the Cincinnati Bengals over the Denver Broncos. I think that there's at least a conversation that can be had, but ultimately, in a playoff scenario like this, I will go with Joe Burrow because I just believe in him. Much like I believe in Matt LaFleur, I believe in the McVay tree. I believe in Joe Burrow when it's do or die in a postseason format. I'm not going to question him.
Yeah, I have pretty much the same reasoning. Like we saw last year, even if the Bengals did narrowly miss the playoffs, they got to the point where they barely missed the playoffs just because Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase just drive them through the season, and Trey Hendrickson on defense. And so I think they're currently working on a potential extension for Trey Hendrickson, which would be huge for our take here. But they did obviously wrap up deals for both Jamar Chase and T. Higgins over the past week, which even if the timing wasn't right because they just waited around for so long and like had to pay them more. Like they waited until like Max Crosby and Myles Garrett signed their deals to sign Jamar Chase to a deal. They waited around for DK Metcalf to get traded and sign a new deal before they signed T. Although I believe T is making a decent amount less than DK, and so waited around a little bit too long in those deals. Maybe Hendrickson too, but at the end of the day, they did do the right thing by signing those guys. You want to retain talent. I think for the Bengals, like they just need to do a better job drafting. They've kind of done a good job of trying to do that in recent years, but like they just haven't had a lot of hits, especially on the defensive side, but not really on offense either. And so when you're paying half of your salary cap to potentially only 4 players, you're going to need a lot of young guys, a lot of draft picks to pan out. So it'll be interesting to see because I think that this, like the Bengals versus Broncos, but really this conversation around the Bengals in general for 2025 could come down big time to just how impactful the rookie class is. But yeah, at the end of the day, the Bengals have Joe Burrow, so that'll make.
I do think that's a good point, Gus. As I think we're in agreement. It's Packers Bengals in our championship of this mock bracket. But with that said, I do think the point you just made about the Bengals drafting over the last 3 to 4 years, not only do they need to hit in this April's NFL draft, but you can make the argument that they really haven't hit with their day 1, day 2 draft capital over the last 2 years. Yes, there's been a couple hits, but certainly, when you go on down the line, whether it's along the defensive line where they keep throwing resources and, Byron Murphy has been okay. He hasn't been necessarily what they expected him to be. Chris Jenkins was a 2nd-round pick, good player, not necessarily a game changer. You go through the secondary, and certainly there's some names there, whether it's Dax Hill, DJ Turner, Cam Taylor-Britt, guys that they've invested premium draft capital in, and they haven't necessarily gotten all that they thought they would. And the offensive line, I'm not even going to go through. And that's where I look at, while Amarius Mims has taken the next step and he's been good, they haven't had an elite draft pick since Jamar Chase. And that's where I wonder how sustainable it is moving forward for the Cincinnati Bengals. And perhaps for our listeners, maybe that changes how you feel about our championship round.
Yeah, Bengals certainly have a lot of things to figure out, both on their defense, but I think offensive line is like really the main question mark. Like I could see, since defense is kind of fluky over year to year, I could see them like kind of lucking into a couple turnovers and being like just good enough to get by, especially if they are going to potentially outscore everyone. But that offensive line could be a real issue. And I wouldn't be surprised if at this time next year or at like the end of next season, one of the main talking points across the entire league is like, what are the Bengals going to do to fix their offensive line? But the Bengals, even still, made our championship round matchup. So let's do one more look at the bracket. Again, it's not pure chalk. We just had another upset with the 3-seeded Bengals taking down the 2-seeded Broncos. So the championship is the 1-seeded Packers against the 3-seeded Bengals, for which 2024 third-place NFL team will do best in 2025. Mia, Packers or Bengals? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to go Packers solely because I think that there's depth on both sides of the ball. Even if I led off this podcast by bringing up the question marks surrounding Jordan Love, Matt LaFleur proved in that second game of 2024 when they had to trot Malik Willis out there and they ran the ball 35 times or whatever it was in the first half, literally ran it down the throats of Gus Bradley and the Indianapolis Colts, and it did not matter. Clearly, having Josh Jacobs on the roster changed the trajectory of that offense. And I think that even if it wasn't a marquee name like him, I think that Matt LaFleur places much more of an emphasis on running the ball than a lot of people give him credit for. And I think that hopefully, with Liam Cohen being from that same tree here locally with the Jacksonville Jaguars, that same idea of even if the quarterback has deficiencies, he doesn't have to be all world. We don't have to put it all on him because we have a capable running game. We have invested in the offensive line. And you couple that with Jeff Hafley's defense, which clearly with the hiring of Anthony Campanile here in Jacksonville and so many other branches that I think are going to be picked off of, the Jeff Hafley defense is in vogue in the NFL. And so that coupled with, yes, they also followed. I don't think people give Brian Gutekunst enough credit. They have also followed Howie Roseman's idea of let me just take as many Georgia Bulldogs as I can on defense and something good will happen to my team.
Yeah, they just have like the most complete team. Even like going back to the quarterback conversation, even if we both think that Trevor might have a slight edge over Jordan Love, I think that we could all agree that Joe Burrow is a better quarterback than Jordan Love. But the Packers have the best team around him. They're able to do the most to help him out. I think Joe Burrow, like they kind of do this on purpose with the Bengals, like have Joe Burrow always playing on hard mode, which is just like gives such a small margin for error. And so like obviously it works out a little bit better when you have Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. But I am looking forward for the Jaguars' perspective to see how much Liam Cohen is able to like press easy buttons for Trevor Lawrence. Me and Dan Bazzuta on yesterday's show had a really good conversation about that. So I recommend going back and checking out episode 89. But yeah, I think that like Trevor has gotten like this nickname online of like all 22 Trev, of like the people that support him are usually film watchers. And it's not even because like when you watch the film, it's like Jordan Love type plays where it's like, oh, he's making like sweet highlight throws. Like this guy can like hit any area of the field. He's got this crazy cannon of an arm. And like all those things are true. But the reason that like Trevor has so many fans when people watch him on all 22 is that he like is so precise and is playing on hard mode. And anytime that something goes wrong, like it's really hard to, or it's rare that you like point the finger at Trevor for like this play didn't work because of Trevor Lawrence. Obviously, he has his fair share of bad plays and negative plays, and so it's not like it's 0%, but it's a way lower percentage than the majority of people think, especially the majority of people who don't watch film, which isn't to say like if you don't watch film, you don't know anything, but it's hard to know what's going on just like with a live broadcast, not being able to see full routes and everything like that. So being able to go back and watch replays and stuff and recognize Trevor's actually not at fault a lot here. And so to make the game easier for him to click some easier buttons, I think could potentially help the Jaguars to, I don't know, do better than the Packers, but it seems that the Packers are our champions for this bracket exercise.
As I like to say, Trevor has 2 to 3 brain farts a season, and we will give him grace for those 2 to 3 brain farts. I also am hoping that you're not hearing the landscaping people outside my house, and maybe that's our cue to say congrats to the Green Bay Packers for winning the Duval Rundown first ever bracket challenge. Yep. And we will be back next Thursday. Of course, you'll be back tomorrow with Hacker. And I did get an interesting text during the program, Gus. Hopefully, maybe we can have another basketball pseudo-themed episode next week in honor of March Madness, but maybe with a guest potentially. So we'll see. We'll see if we can get a certain basketball analyst on the program next week.
Yeah, well, I've learned my lesson. I'm not making any promises on the show. I do have a really fun guest lined up for Wednesday as well, but not going to reveal it quite yet.
Ooh, okay.
But excited for next week for sure. Excited for March Madness this weekend. Me, I know you got to run, but any takes on March Madness, men's or women's brackets?
I'm still scared about taking Florida, but in women's basketball, I have this blind faith in E.L. Ivy and Notre Dame. Let's see if it pays off for me.
Gotcha. I will say that I, as a Gator graduate and Gator fan, am participating in a lot of pools with fellow Gators, and so as much as I want to take the Gators, I think I'm going to hedge them emotionally, but also hedge in terms of bracket pool competition. So Texas Tech, that's my team coming out. Yep. Okay. I know that a lot of people are going to say, "Oh, St. John's, that'll be a good upset over Florida." Now, Texas Tech, that's my non-Gators team in this tournament.
Grant McCaslin's an easy guy to root for. He was coaching high school basketball like 5 minutes ago. So I'm here for rooting for a great Cinderella story like that.
All right, that'll do it. I will be back tomorrow at 9:04 a.m. Eastern with Hacker breaking down more Jaguars, perhaps more March Madness. Me will be back next Thursday. Thanks, as always, to you, Mia, to you, our listeners/watchers, and have a good day of basketball. See you guys.